Democratic debate, and we're joined now by the man invoked in that question, Senator Marco Rubio, also running for president, member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Senator Rubio, thank you for joining us this morning. You saw Secretary Clinton there, did not want to use the words radical Islam. Your response?
I think I don't understand it. That would be like saying we weren't at war with Nazis because we were afraid to offend some Germans who may have been members of the Nazi Party but weren't violent themselves. We are at war with radical Islam, with an interpretation of Islam by a significant number of people around the world who they believe now justifies them in killing those who don't agree with their ideology. This is a clash of civilizations. And as I said at the debate earlier this week, there is no middle ground on this. Either they win or we win. And we need to begin to take this seriously. These are individuals motivated by their faith. Of course, all Muslims are not members of violent jihadist groups. But there is a global jihadist movement in the world motivated by their interpretation of Islam, in this case Sunni Islam, in the case of ISIS. And it needs to be confronted for what it is. This is not a geopolitical movement. This is a religiously oriented movement.
We did just hear the President's Assistant Ben Rhodes say that this is an act of war by ISIL, and the U.S. will have to be nimble in its response. What do you think the President should be doing right now?
Well, first, I would ask our allies to invoke Article 5. This was clearly an act of war, an attack on one of our NATO allies. And we should invoke Article 5 of the NATO agreement and bring everyone together to put together a coalition to confront this challenge.
Confront it how, though? What exactly would you do? One of your rivals, Senator Lindsey Graham, says put 10,000 troops on the ground.
Well, I think it's premature to say the exact numbers. I would say this. I think that we need to begin to work more closely, for example, with the Sunni tribes in Iraq who do not want to work under the thumb of the central government in Iraq. We've worked with them in the past.
Isn't that what's happening now?
No, it is not, unfortunately. We continue to outsource much of this through the Baghdad, and Baghdad is more interested in pursuing and protecting the Shia groups, many of whom are under the control of Iran. They also are continuing to double down on their own domestic forces, which quite frankly have proven unreliable. The best fighters on the ground have proven to be the Kurds, and to some extent the Sunni tribes who are autonomous, but we're not directly supporting them. And so that needs to begin to happen. We also have to get our Sunni allies in the region more involved in this fight. The only way to ultimately defeat ISIS is for them to be defeated ideologically and militarily by Sunnis themselves.
But is all that going to work without more United States troops?
Well, there will have to be a significant American engagement, and that is why we should work more closely with our allies in the region, for example, to station American air support closer to the fight. Right now, we're conducting a lot of these airstrikes off of aircraft carriers. If we had more of these planes, I know some are flying out of Turkey, we should be requesting areas in Iraq. We could conduct a lot more airstrikes if we had that in place.
So, wait, but so let me stop you there, though. So you're saying more airstrikes, but you're not willing to say more
ground
troops.
Well, you're not letting me finish, George.
Okay, go ahead.
No, look, I also believe that we need to increase the number of special operators. Key to the success of this is we are going to have to conduct an increased number of special operations attacks targeting ISIS leadership and revealing that they are not invincible. In essence, subjecting them to high-profile, humiliating defeats where we strike them, we capture or kill their leaders, we videotape the operations, we publicize them, because this is a group that heavily uses propaganda to attract fighters and donors from around the world. And they're presenting themselves as this invincible force. And we need to cut off that narrative. It isn't true. And that's important. And we will need much more than 50 special operators on the ground. Long term, however, in the big picture, the only way to defeat ISIS militarily is for Sunnis themselves to be the bulkhead of the fight. But it will require us to do more in the short stage. And this is what we need to be doing to defeat ISIS over there. There's a host of other things we need to be doing to keep America safe here at home.
One of your rivals, Senator Ted Cruz, said over the weekend that we have to dramatically ramp up the airstrikes, even if it means more civilian casualties.
Well, look, I don't think any nation on earth takes more pains in avoiding civilian casualties than the United States. The reality, unfortunately, is that many of these terrorist groups deliberately operate from the center of civilian areas because they want there to be civilian casualties for propaganda use. We've seen that as well used by the enemies of Israel on repeated occasions. Obviously, we're going to take great pains to avoid civilian casualties, but at the end of the day, no one's killed more civilians and more innocents here than ISIS has. And although we'll take extraordinary steps to avoid civilian casualties, there's, of course, no guarantee, especially given the fact that you're operating against these individuals who have no regard for human life.
some evidence that one of those attackers in Paris may have been a refugee from Syria coming through Greece. They're not completely sure of that yet, but it has put a lot of attention on the president's decision to increase the number of refugees from Syria. And it's also creating some criticism for you from one of your rivals. Rand Paul says that a couple of years ago on the immigration bill, you blocked an amendment that would have made it difficult for refugees with a terrorist past to get. I want to show what he said.
2-3 years ago, I introduced a bill or an amendment to the immigration bill that would have provided for more scrutiny for people coming into our country. Refugees, immigrants, students. They would have had background checks. Mine was a national security amendment as well as an immigration amendment, and Marco blocked it.
Your response?
Well, look, Rand just uses this sort of rhetoric to distract from his very weak record on national security issues. I mean, he's been one of the leading figures trying to gut the American intelligence programs. Think about the metadata program for a moment. Imagine if one of those strikes had occurred here in the United States. The first thing we would want to know is, what are the cell phone records of these people? Let's say that, God forbid, what happened in Paris happened in Washington. We would want to know, we would want access to these people's phone records, because it would give us clues as to who they were working with, who probably may be involved in plots themselves later on down the road. Rand Paul wants to get rid of that program. In fact, he's advocated it, and he's one of the leading figures behind part of that program being gutted now.
But did you, in fact, block an amendment that would have required more background checks?
Listen, the background checks are required now. The problem is not the background checks. The problem is we can't background check them. You can't pick up the phone and call Syria, and that's one of the reasons why I've said we won't be able to take more refugees. It's not that we don't want to, it's that we can't, because there's no way to background check someone that's coming from Syria. Who do you call and do a background check on them? The bottom line is that this is not just a threat coming from abroad. What we need to open up to and realize is that we have a threat here at home. Homegrown violent extremists, individuals that perhaps have not even traveled abroad, who have been radicalized online. This has become a multifaceted threat. In the case of what's happening in Europe, this is a swarm of refugees, and as I've said repeatedly over the last few months, you can have 1,000 people come in, and 999 of them are just poor people fleeing, oppression and violence. But one of them is an ISIS fighter. If that's the case, you have a problem. And there's no way to vet that out. There's no background check system that allows us to find that out, because who do you call in Syria to background check them?
How have these attacks changed the race for the White House? Do you agree with the analysis that some have put forward that it's going to make it more difficult for outsider candidates with limited foreign policy experience like Donald Trump and Ben Carson to succeed?
Well, I don't think this is time to be doing political analysis on all of this. This is a major threat to our country and the world. I have said this repeatedly throughout the race. The #1 obligation of the federal government is to secure is to provide for our security. I said that in the debate the other night again. And I hope this is a reminder that the federal government is involved in all sorts of things. But the one thing it must do, and only it can do, is provide for our national security. I made the point the other night that all this talk about economic growth and prosperity becomes very impossible to achieve if we're not safe. And this is a reminder of it. Just 48 hours ago in Paris, France, we were reminded of what happens to a country when it feels insecure.
Senator Rubio, thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks, George.